Energy Transition Now with David Linden.
Hello everyone, I'm your host, David Linden, the Head of Energy Transition for the Westwood Global Energy Group, and you're listening to Energy Transition Now, where we discuss what the transition really means for the oil and gas and the broader energy industry. Today, we're going to be looking at petrochemicals and why they may or may not save oil demand. And that could be seen by some maybe as quite controversial. So that's why it's great to have David Hughes, the CEO of New Normal, here with us, 35-year veteran, if I'm allowed to say that, of the global petrochemicals industry with us today. Hello, David.
Hello, David. Good to be with you.
Perfect. Yes, as everyone will know, it's now two Davids, so I hope it doesn't get too confusing.
We'll try and remember who we are.
Absolutely. David, though, thanks for taking the time. I guess just to begin with, I introduced you as the CEO as New Normal, and I'm sure not everyone knows who you are and what you do, etc. So maybe just to get the ball rolling, if you could just talk us through what you guys do and how you do that.
Yeah, so New Normal is a boutique consultancy. There's about 10 of us working there, focusing mainly on the chemical industry, not entirely, but mostly on the chemical industry. And we're all chemical industry veterans. I think it's still true that even with 35 years experience, I'm the youngest one of the team. So that gives you some idea of the people we have in the team. In case people have heard of us, in the past we called ourselves International Echem. We changed the name to New Normal about 2 years ago, reflecting the change in the mood in the industry and the things that we think are important. It was before the pandemic, but everybody is talking about the new normal now after the pandemic, and maybe later on we'll talk about the impact of the pandemic on demand for plastics, for polymers, and for chemicals in general. So that's new normal. Over the past couple of years, we've focused increasingly on two topics, really: the energy transition and the issue of plastic waste and recycling. My history, as you said, I've been 35 years in the industry. I started with ICI, the UK chemical company, and then ended up with SABIC, the Saudi Arabian chemical giant, running a number of their global businesses. So that's my background.
Perfect. Thanks, David. Yeah, we'll pop your bio onto the page as well. So if folks want to see a little bit more there, you'll see it there. If you're the youngest with 35 years experience, obviously there's quite a bit that's happened during that period of time to the industry. Could you maybe just take us back, just to how has that industry evolved? And if people don't quite know what petrochemicals maybe is, if you could just give us a very brief, basic 101, what is the kind of petrochemicals industry and how has it evolved over the last, well, I don't want to say just 35 years, but sort of in recent history, should we call it?
In recent history, well, it is a relatively young industry, I guess. It grew after the Second World War. There was a chemical industry before the First World War, before the Second World War, but the industry we know now really grew after the Second World War as the common polymers were invented. So the common polymers, polyethylene or polythene as we call it, polypropylene, PVC, PET, the things that we use in everyday life were invented by the chemical industry largely after the Second World War. And that growth became enormously rapid as the population grew after the Second World War with a baby boom, as incomes grew, and the chemical industry, we like to say, built today's life. If you look at the stuff around you today, literally everything that isn't glass or wood or metal is plastic. Yeah? And that's the thing which has transformed life from the world we were in Victorian times and for thousands of years before to today's modern world. So we're very, very proud of the chemical industry and that we have produced products that people want and need and use. It's only recently, I think, that we've realized that that comes with a price, and it comes with a price in terms of environmental issues, in particular plastic waste and single-use plastics and so on, and that the world is now waking up to that, and that the the chemical industry has to transform to live for the future and find a new role for itself in the future. We're very, very optimistic about the product demand. We still think that people want the products that we make, that there are no alternatives to many of our products, and they are the most environmentally friendly solution. But we have to solve this problem of plastic waste and the carbon footprint of the industry to some extent as well. The chemical industry is largely that I'm talking about is largely the polymer industry. There are other liquid chemicals, methanol and ammonia and things like that, but most of the time, I think for the rest of today, we'll be talking about the polymer industry. And just to give a sense of scale, and I think in tons, and we always have to convert tons and barrels, but I tend to think in tons. The largest of the chemicals is ethylene. Ethylene is a gas, but it is used largely for polyethylene, polythene. And there's about 160 million tons of ethylene produced in the world every year, of which 100 million, a little bit more, goes into polyethylene. So that's the kind of scale of business that we're talking about. And in total, there's about 300 million tons of solid plastic made in the world every year.
And if I was to sort of convert that into a different scale, so a lot of people that I work with talk about how many million barrels of oil are currently being consumed. If you were to convert that into sort of maybe a rough percentage, if you don't have to sort of stick to the barrel, if you see what I'm saying.
Yeah. So where does that chemical come from? It comes largely from oil in the form of naphtha.
Yeah.
Naphtha is fed to various chemical plants, the biggest of which is the ethylene cracker. And about 6% of world oil demand goes into the chemical industry in the form of naphtha, going into naphtha crackers. And then on top of that, there's a relatively small amount, but important in certain geographies, of ethane coming out of the gas separation units. And ethane can also be turned into ethylene very cheaply and conveniently. So wherever there is ethane coming out of gas, then that ethane is typically converted into ethylene as well.
It's interesting to hear all those different names. So I have a background in the natural gas industry originally, and there's a lot of overlap between, ethylene, ethane, and listening to all these different names and how they've come across. And it's interesting when you also said methanol and ammonia. So suddenly anyone who's interested in hydrogen starts talking about methanol and ammonia when they didn't have to or need to before. So it kind of shows you the overlap between those industries. But what I did find interesting was, so when we first sort of spoke, I guess, on this topic, you mentioned that sort of chemicals is a leading indicator for the global economy in some ways, right? Now, you might tell me that's not necessarily true anymore, but is that just simply because it's so fundamental in that sense to everything we do? Is that right?
Absolutely. So, as I kind of said in my preamble, it's everywhere, right? And whether you're buying consumer durables, fridges and freezers and cars, the second biggest consumer of the chemical industry. Construction is the biggest consumer for the chemical industry, followed by automotive. Or whether you're talking about day-to-day stuff and food and drink and packaging and all of those things, all of those drive chemical demand, and chemical demand drives, though chemical availability drives those businesses. So there's a very, very strong correlation between chemical activity and overall activity as measured by GDP. The American Chemistry Council, the industry body in the US, used to publish a set of statistics every month on the occupacity in the chemical industry, and that correlated extraordinarily well with global GDP 3 or 6 months down the track. Unfortunately, they've stopped producing those statistics now. But nonetheless, the chemical industry is so central that if you understand the chemical industry, you understand what's going on in the global economy, and vice versa.
So I remember when I first got into the global sort of energy market mix, sort of moving out of my sort of natural gas hat and putting more global market on and looking at all the different competing fuels, et cetera. And as I went through that journey, year after year, people like to talk about petrochemicals as a real opportunity, a growth opportunity. and those sorts of things. And so when they talked about the future of that industry, but also how important it was, A, as you say, for the economy, but B, also for the oil industry as a whole, it was always that petrochemicals are going to be so important for the future of this industry. So let's try and access that more. That's our future growth engine, et cetera, et cetera. What's your sort of view of that? Let's say the last few years, how people have been thinking about the industry and the future growth of that industry. Was that basically GDP equals chemicals demand with big growth in Asia? Therefore, there must be a big market out there. Or am I simplifying it too much?
No, I mean, I think you're broadly there. The chemical market was growing at multiples of GDP because it was playing catch up, right? And demand was there. As I said, it was a relatively new industry. Industries like PET. PET is bottle polymer, the thing that goes into your Coke bottle, but the same chemical is what makes polyester fiber and polyester clothes. And this is a derivative of a chemical called xylene, which would otherwise end up in gasoline if we didn't take it out for the chemical industry. PET growth could be 10, 12, 15% a year in the 90s as Asia caught up, as bottle demand grew in the West, as we were replacing aluminium and glass in Coke bottles, as we got a fad for drinking, water and carrying a bottle of water around with us, and as Asian people became richer and bought new clothes, which tended to be polyester clothes rather than cotton clothes, then demand was really very, very high, and you had multiples of GDP for almost all of the chemical chains. That has slowed down now, and most of the major chemical chains are kind of at GDP rates of growth now. A little bit higher, a little bit lower, depending on the market. So that period of explosive growth, as we substituted older products with plastics, that stopped. And I think now we have to get a little bit more granular if we want to understand chemical demand growth, because packaging sectors are clearly growing now in a different way to consumer durable sectors, what's happening to the automotive sector and so on. I think if we really want to understand chemical demand, we have to dig a bit deeper. But that demand growth is there. The question is, where will it be met from? What will actually produce that? Is it going to be the conventional oil or gas-based petrochemicals? Will it be new bio-based petrochemicals? Will it be recycling? Will it be reuse? Will people stop, in fact, buying some of this stuff? Will we see reverse substitution, or will we see us going back to some more natural products, or glass or aluminium or whatever it may be? But there have been people, of course, even quite recently, suggesting that petrochemicals can still save the oil industry in some sense. Not to spoil the plot, but my answer would probably no, because it's just too small, right? It's only 6% of oil demand, right? So even if that grows by 50%, it's still a relatively small percentage of oil demand we're talking about here.
And I guess you started to allude to it there as well. The sector's already changing, right? So that where the demand's coming from now. I do wonder whether it might be useful to go through one or two of those specific sectors and just talk about what is changing. You mentioned the automotive sector. You mentioned how different plastics are used in consumable goods, etc. Could we maybe just take one or two of those and sort of walk through what's happening there that sort of indicates change?
Well, I think the sector which is most clearly under change is the packaging sector, single-use plastics. And the world is asking itself two questions, I think. One is it sensible that we have billions of dollars of infrastructure digging oil out of the ground, refining it, putting it through chemical plants, putting it through packaging, through polymer plants, putting it through warehousing, for it to be turned into a plastic bag which is used for literally 10 minutes and then thrown away? Does that fit with the zeitgeist of the world? increasingly, I think not. And that's not just a European issue. I often hear, oh, this packaging, single-use plastic thing, this is a European issue. It's not a European issue. It's very definitely a Chinese issue. It's very differently, for example, Kenya was one of the first countries in the world to impose penalties for using single-use plastic bags. If you'd like to guess, you could try and guess what the penalty for using or giving away a single-use plastic bag in Kenya is. Would you like to guess?
I don't know. No idea. Imprisonment.
It is imprisonment.
It is
It's
imprisonment.
actually a
Okay,
maximum
wow.
of 4 years. 4 years imprisonment. Now, whether anybody's ever been in prison for 4 years, I don't know. But,
Wow.
there you go. Kenya, not what you would have thought of as the most environmentally conscious country in the world, has some incredibly stringent rules about plastic waste. So plastic waste is one issue. Yeah. Sorry.
Yes.
Well, single-use plastic. Does it make sense to use our natural resources to produce something which is used for literally 10 minutes? And secondly, when we have used it for 10 minutes, David Attenborough told us very emotionally in Blue Planet 2 that that plastic ends up in the ocean and it sits in the ocean for hundreds of years and it kills things. And a McKinsey study a few years ago did some extrapolation and said that by 2050, if we carry on as we are today, there'll be more weight of plastic in the ocean than will be weight of fish in the ocean. Now that's simply unacceptable. So the packaging industry sees itself, squeezed from both ends. It's squeezed at the front end. What are the resources? We still need carbon atoms, right? The chemical industry is fundamentally putting carbon atoms together with other things to make the things that we want. So we still need carbon atoms. Where will those carbon atoms come from? Oil and gas or somewhere else? And at the end of life, what are we going to do to stop the material ending up in the ocean or being buried and still being in the ground 300 years later? Yeah, so that's the issue facing the polymer industry, the packaging industry, and the answer to those is that the chemical industry and a pile of new entrants are looking at both ends of that problem.
Okay.
There's a German institute called the Nova Institute, very respected institute. They were commissioned by Unilever. So the packaging companies, the brand owners are really critically interested in this. Unilever commissioned a study from the Nova Institute a couple of years ago, and they suggested that by 2050, there would be in fact no fossil carbon going into the plastics chain. That even though there would be massive demand growth, that demand growth in the future, in fact, all of the demand will be met either by recycling, and in their model, they have about 50% of the plastics that we use going into recycling, about 25% coming from bio sources, using bio feedstock to make conventional or new polymers, and 25% coming from some form of other carbon and things like Fischer-Tropsch processes that put together CO2 with hydrogen to make polymers or make new chemicals from that route. That would create the other 25% in the Nova Institute scenario for 2050.
Okay, that's really fascinating. I mean, it sounds very similar, right, to the general energy transition, which is we've got a problem, we've got somewhere to get to by 2050, but it requires a bunch of innovation and, by the sounds of it, regulation, mindset change, et cetera, et cetera. From this industry here, though, how far, because there's lots of studies like this, I'm assuming. I mean, this is obviously one particular one you're referencing, but how far down the road are we really going? How strong is this driver? Because is this like Unilever saying we should do this? And we know Unilever's been pretty, had a podcast just before this that we talked to a lady called Sally Walker, who talked about values driven versus value driven, right? So she recognized that a lot of companies, need some of those values in them because they need to jumpstart what they think about how they do the transition versus purely just value driven, right? Is this driven by values, or is this actually driven by commercial reality and or regulation that's coming out that's saying, look, you're ultimately going to have to do this. So here's your not your imprisonment necessarily, but your penalty of sorts if you don't.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very, very interesting question. It seems to me that the drive for change could come from three places. It could come from you and me. It could be our individual choices when we go into a shop as to what we choose to buy. It could be the brand owners making those choices for us, the Unilevers, the Danones, the PepsiCos of this world. Or it could be regulation. It could be governments making those choices. And at the moment, it feels like it is largely the brands actually driving this. All of the major brands, all of the major packaging brands have signed up to a set of commitments that together form a thing called the New Plastics Economy. And if you go to newplasticseconomy.org, I think it is, you'll see the companies that have signed up to these principles and the principles themselves, which include recycling targets, but also total removal of fossil carbon out of the packaging chain. So the brands are driving this, not individual consumers. And I don't think it will ever be individual consumers, but the brands are extremely conscious of this. Coca-Cola said to us privately, they are obviously huge buyers of packaging, in particular PET that we talked about before. They said we will never buy more fossil-based PET than we buy today. That we've hit the peak of that. That's it.
Wow.
On the other hand, if you can give me recycled or bio PET, I will buy as much of that as you can give me. And frankly, I don't care about the price. Yeah.
Wow. Now, why is that? Sorry, just to stop you there. Is that just because actually, in the grand scheme of things, in terms of the cost of the overall, manufacturing process, it's too small?
Yes, it doesn't matter to them.
Okay.
In fact, they're also indifferent to material because they typically don't own their own bottling plants, so they can switch very quickly because they just tell their suppliers what to do, right? They don't have their own capital tied up in this. They don't have their own bottle manufacturing plants. They have their own bottling plants. So they can switch very rapidly. It's of zero cost to Danone to say I'm now going to go to a different type of packaging because they don't care, right? So it's all about brand. It's all about brand for these guys, and they have decided that their brand will not have this material in it. Okay. And then regulation is important, of course, but it tends to follow public opinion rather than lead it in some of these things. And here the EU is ahead of the game, and you may be aware that there is now an €800 a ton penalty put on any non-recycled plastics used in packaging, as it rolled out as we speak now. And that, roughly speaking, doubles the price of the plastic. €800 a ton is not far off the average cost of polyethylene packaging anyway. Yeah. So the EU is imposing a tax. Any non-recycled content in packaging is subject to this €800 a ton penalty. And that does focus people's minds pretty quickly as well, right? So there is a lot going on both from the brands and from the regulator that's pushing in this direction. But it turns out it's a hard problem, right? Recycling plastics is a really, really tough problem. It's easy for a couple of things. Coke bottles are actually pretty easy because they are a single polymer. They are just PET, and everybody in the world knows what a Coke bottle looks like. Now, and waste recycling is actually still quite a manual process. So there are actually people who are, at the end of the day, pulling waste plastic out of the conveyor belt of waste. And if they see a Coke bottle, they know that's PET. The other one that's easy to recycle is plastic milk bottles, those white plastic milk bottles. Those are made of they're a form of polyethylene called high-density polyethylene. They're also a single material. They're also big enough to be able to physically pull them out of the waste. So they get recycled. But your little bits of plastic, your crisp packets, your plastic bags, those are the problem. They're a problem for two reasons. One, they blow about. They're tiny things. They're difficult to get hold of. But two, they are typically more than one plastic. So your crisp packet is actually probably 5 layers of plastic sandwiched together, just for fun, with a layer of aluminium in there. That's what gives it that silver color. The aluminium is there to stop oxygen, I think. But you'll have a layer of plastics that's to stop oxygen in and out, a layer that's to stop CO2 in and out, a layer that's to stop moisture in and out, and a layer that you can print on. And then they're all sandwiched together, and that makes your plastic bag or your crisp bag or whatever. And recycling that is a nightmare.
So, okay, that's fascinating. I mean, it kind of tells you one thing. So yeah, that's extremely complex, which might mean that part of it is a bit like we talk in the energy world, right, about the hard to decarbonize sectors. This is the hard to or the wicked problem that you've got in the chemicals world. This is that there are different ends of the scale. You know, the Coca-Cola bottle is the electrification bit. You kind of do that, get on with it.
Yeah.
The other end of the scale is the really hard to abate type stuff. But what I also thought was interesting there is if everyone's being pushed to do recycling, you can't recycle all of it. That sounds like there'll be a supply crunch at some stage.
Well, and that's why in the NOVA study, only 50% of the plastic in 2050 in their model comes from recycling, because there's an inevitable leakage in this, right? Or almost inevitable leakage. Yeah. So you still need some top-up quantities, and it could be that those top-up quantities are coming from oil and gas, like today. But that oil and gas will only have 50% market share rather than 100% market share. But it could be zero market share if this other stuff about bio-based feedstocks, which is technically possible, economically unattractive, but technically possible, and some of the stuff about carbon capture and CO2 chemistry could also happen in the next 20 years, but it's starting from a zero base today. And I think this is a challenge for chemical companies today, and it will be even more so, I would guess, for your sector of oil and gas players, is that this recycling or this bio-based stuff is inevitably smaller scale than the flows that we're used to handling, right? We don't, as a chemical industry, we don't get out of bed if it's less than 1 million tons a year, whatever the equivalent is in your barrels a day, right?
Yeah.
But recycling takes place on a local basis. It will never make economic or environmental sense to haul plastic waste around the world. That will not be societally acceptable. And therefore, you're going to collect the plastic waste in a location, and even a large city, London, will not be producing 1 million tons of plastic waste a year, right? It might be producing 100,000, 200,000 tons of plastic waste a year. So you now have to recycle on a local basis, which means setting up much smaller scale facilities than you're used to doing it. And the chemical industry is really struggling to get its mind around that. How does it operate? Is it even in its business model? Can it be bothered? And the danger is that there are people out there who can be bothered, and actually maybe the chemical industry just loses this business because it couldn't be bothered today to set up these small things that don't move the needle today. These things today don't move the needle for a chemical company.
This is what was just listening to you there. It's fascinating. You just need to replace some words, and it's the same as like oil and gas companies getting into EV charging. It's a bit like, well, why? It's so small scale. It's I actually think I had to get involved in local, distributed networks and all this type of stuff. Why? It's worth nothing. And of course, only some companies are doing that, and others are saying, that's definitely not my business. But are they going to miss out of the business of the future?
Yeah.
Because, how is the car going to be charged? How is that infrastructure going to work? And if you're not in it, then you're not producing the electricity, you're not supplying, you're not being part of the network, etc. So it's an interesting debate, which is very similar, and there are very clear lines drawn between companies who feel this is their future versus others. And again, it's the same thing. It's just, this is a European thing. Well, actually, I think if you look at the kind of rollout of charging infrastructure in China, it's a very different story. But yeah, I mean, it's just very interesting to hear, because it's essentially the same argument in a different part of the value chain.
So we're seeing a pile of entrepreneurs there. There's a bit of a wild west going on in terms of technologies to do this rather difficult trick that we were talking about before. But interestingly, we are seeing the retailers get involved in this. So Schwarz Group, who I think they're the fourth biggest retailer in the world, they own Lidl and a number of other people.
Okay. Yeah.
They're piling into this in a really powerful way, because they can control the recycler. They can get people to bring their waste plastics back to the shop. It means giving up shop space for this, which they don't like, but they get their hands on clean waste before it's been mixed with all the other rubbish which is in the waste and picked up contamination. They can get clean waste, and if you can get clean waste, that's half the problem. So, we'll see non-traditional chemical companies come into this space, just as I'm sure you'll see non-traditional oil companies come into the new energy space, as you've been talking about it.
I have a slight bias. So my wife works in the circular economy side of things, and she often talks about the ability just to reuse, replace, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, this is essentially a subsector or subsector of that in that sense. But it also talks about other sort of ways of thinking about the problem, right? One is it's typically more local, and as you say, that's essentially what's happening here, right? Is a lot more of a local question, local problem. But there's also that idea almost of something as a service, so that people don't own the plastic, let's just say, they simply borrow it for their use and then hand it back, and that works. And I think the classic example I remember being bounded around is Philips did the sort of service as a light at Schiphol Airport, one of the terminals, and Schiphol don't own any of the light bulbs, none of the infrastructure, etc. All they say is, well, your contract is to produce light, give me the light, right? And then they do the service around that, which means they can actually have full ownership, control of the value chain, and stuff breaks, they fix it, etc. They get paid for that. And I'm assuming, right, that's what people are thinking about here, maybe, right? I mean, if you think about, I grew up in Germany originally, it was quite normal to take your bottle down to the to the local supermarket and recycle it. I know you couldn't call it circular economy per se 100%, but essentially that's what it feels like the target should be, right?
Yeah, and I mean, that's really interesting to talk about that. We do see a little bit of this service concept coming into the chemical industry in a totally different piece of the industry. I was working with a company who produces a solvent which is used in metal cleaning. So if you're making a car, you want grease-free metal. So this is a solvent that produces, grease-free metal. It's quite nasty solvent. So these days, instead of people selling the solvent to the metal bashers, they sell a service, which is, I will clean 5 tons of metal, or 1,000 square meters of metal plate, or whatever it is, and I'll bring in the solvent, and I'll handle the solvent, and I'll take the solvent back, and I'll clean it. And so instead of selling tons of product, they now sell a service which is clean metal for making cars from, right? So we do see this service-based concept coming into the chemical industry in small ways, right? But in the main, we're still about selling tons, right? It's still about selling tons today.
Yes. We'll have to get to barrels one day, but yeah.
It's about 7.5 barrels per ton, something like that.
7.5 barrels per ton. Yes, I should know that probably. All right, David, that was fantastic. Very interesting indeed. I think we've pretty much come to the end of our time here. Thank you so much for sharing that. Fascinating, certainly what's happening in the petrochemicals industry, and just bizarrely how it seems to align quite a lot with what's happening in the energy transition as a whole as well. So a really interesting talk. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I enjoyed it.
Perfect. And thanks everyone for listening as well. Hope you enjoyed it. Please subscribe, give us a good rating, and share with your friends. Talk to you next time.